or in person or on Zoom. So I've been talking to some colleagues. We've hosted few conferences in person, and in retrospect, now we're also doing this on Zoom. Those conferences seems like just a piece of cake. So, and Zoom people, I will speak directly to you and ask you to use the chat if there are any problems with audio or video. More often, the problem is with audio. So again, welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm a professor of philosophy, Allen Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College. King's is a relatively small Catholic liberal arts college in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is more or less in the northeast corner of the state. Everybody here in the room knows that on Zoom. That might be news to you. As I said, we've hosted several conferences. This is the third in recent years that we've organized and hosted. The McGowan Center hosts from 10 to 15 lectures and panel discussions per academic year, all now on Zoom if you want to join us again, even when they're also in person. The idea for this conference dates back to fall 2019, and we even considered hosting the conference in fall 2021. We hatched, you can all imagine, pre-pandemic, a world ago, it sometimes seems, and also before people joined so-called in-person conferences by Zoom. And I don't think we would refer to in-person conferences as in-person conferences. Didn't really know quite that distinction. We're all right on Zoom still? Good. If you do have any problems on Zoom, please use the chat, and my colleague will try to fix that issue. The conference will speak for itself about its themes, so let me turn to thanking the many people who deserve to be thanked. To begin with, the other members of the planning committee, and they're all here. My colleague at King's, Dr. Chris O'Brien, who is Dean of Health Sciences here, Dr. Bob Baracco, who is the Chief Academic Officer of the Lehigh Valley Health Network, and Dr. Joshua Schultz, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at DeSales University and the co-chair of the Lehigh Valley Health Network Ethics Committee. As you've likely surmised, this conference is jointly provided by King's and the Lehigh Valley Health Network. And thanks to you three for our work together. For administrative support, there she is. We owe hearty thanks to Bridget Ford there in the doorway, and later on at the table, I'm sure she'll probably be all over the place. Help with continuing education credits for healthcare professionals. We're very fortunate to have worked with Donna Stout and Michael Pachulis. Chris O'Brien will say more about your continuing education credits. It turns out that that is just a Byzantine world. So we're very grateful to people who helped us. My friend Joe Strubeck advised me on tech, managed the registration, and gave lots of his time to the Ethics Center. Raylan Barrett, I don't see her, was reliable as always in event planning. Adam Sobolka, who's over there, adapted our new tech equipment to this somewhat challenging space, and they also arrived early this morning for setup. Josh Ulanowski and Carol Scholl did first-rate graphic design, for example. Karen Hawkins and colleagues produced whatever we needed from the print shop. Brandy George punched up our publicity. Dr. Scott Weiland in the chair over there volunteered his time this morning to oversee the Zoomcast. And Margaret Kowalski, my wife and partner, listened to me talk about this conference over its 3 years of development. And she also helped me believe that it would be worth seeing through. Thanks to all of you. And I'll give a shout out too to my Aunt Ginny. I wasn't sure whether to do that, but for joining us. I'm grateful also to the college's president, Father Tom Looney, for supporting this event. It is generously funded in large part by the Moses Taylor Foundation, the mission of which is to improve the health of people in Northeast Pennsylvania. Thanks to the foundation's senior program officer, Jeff Smith, for his enthusiasm for our proposal, and Michelle Giovanoli, Director of Institutional and Academic Grants at King's, for her collaboration. Last, but by no means least, thanks to our speakers, whom I'm quite excited to hear. Before inviting Chris to talk about the process for getting those continuing education credits. I should discuss briefly the image that we've used for the conference. For example, here on the screen, on the schedules, on the webpage. This image is taken from George Frederick Watts's 1886 painting, Hope. And Aaron Cobb, our first speaker, will say a bit more about this painting. The blind figure of Hope, seated firmly on a globe, plucks a damaged one-string lyre, which she bends over to hear. Even before the pandemic, there was lots of despair in our culture, as you all know well, over the climate, over the state of our democracy, over rampant gun violence, in the opioid crisis, and in the spike of midlife mortality that the economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton came to call deaths of despair. It's crucial to try to come to terms with the causes of despair. Watts's painting, however, suggests that we must likewise be attentive to hope. Perhaps, given how broken our world is, we can't see a reason for it. Hope is traditionally depicted as blind. But on at least one interpretation of the painting, a note of hope can be heard faintly if we strain to hear it. So welcome again, and thank you again for joining us. Chris.
Thanks, Bernard. And I also would like to directly thank Bernard Prusak's leadership in the conception of this conference and seeing it through. It's been a long process. So thank you to him. A couple housekeeping things on evaluation and continuing education credits. Everyone attending, whether you are seeking continuing education credits or not, will receive after the conference, whether you're online or in person, a link to complete survey through Lehigh Valley Health Network, the Qualtrics survey. I encourage you to complete that, whether or not you are seeking the credits, so we can get a good feel of the assessment of the conference. You need, for those of you seeking the continuing ed credits in a variety of areas, once you complete the survey within 30 days, you will get a certificate of attendance for completing that, and that will be your evidence that you can use. For those of you that require, we've done, it's probably at least 8 different areas, being an interdisciplinary conference. Everyone has a little different statement, a little different type of certificate. Some of you will also receive a second certificate with a specific information for your discipline. I know specifically for physical therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy assistants, occupational therapy assistants, athletic trainers, you will get a second certificate with the specific board statements and the credit right there. This conference is eligible for up to 5.25 CEs of continuing education. For those of you in the room in person, please make sure you sign in or sign out. You are eligible for partial credit if you're only staying the morning or leaving, coming back. Those of you online, we will be able to log your attendance through our online mechanism to be able to determine the length of your participation. And I'll be around throughout the day and at the breaks if you have any questions here in the room to talk about that, or you can also add those in the chat and we'll get back to you. So without further ado, I want to bring up, introduce our speaker. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the conference, Health, Hope, and Despair. Might be the 3rd or 4th person who's issued that welcome. I'm Dr. Regan Lance Reitzma. I'm chair of the philosophy department here at King's and director, or now co-director of the honors program. I'm honored and very happy to introduce our first 2 speakers for really the first big event today. Our primary speaker is Dr. Aaron Cobb, who's a professor of philosophy at Auburn University at Montgomery. Aaron's current research, same as the talk today, focuses on virtue ethics, especially applied virtue ethics and biomedical ethics. Aaron's the author of 2 really excellent books: A Virtue-Based Defense of Perinatal Hospice, which was published by Routledge just a few years ago, 2019, and Loving Samuel, Suffering, Dependence, and the Calling of Love, which came out in 2014 from Cascade. That is a beautifully written and very moving philosophical and theological memoir on the life and death of Aaron's son. Aaron is speaking at King's actually for the 2nd time. So if it's a compliment to invite an academic to give a public talk at your university once, it must be an especially big compliment to ask him to come back again. So we're very happy to have Dr. Cobb with us today. This is going to take the form of a speaker, Aaron, with a respondent. Respondent today is going to be Dr. Nicole Hoskins, who is an assistant professor in the theology and religious studies department at Scranton, right up the road from King's here. Her current academic research project examines environmental racism, as well as the religious ecological practices of Black women in scaled gardens in Chicago. One comment about how, if you're online, you should, if you want to ask questions, there's going to be a speaker, Dr. Cobb, a respondent, Dr. Hoskins, and then a Q&A. If you're online, I've been asked to use the Q&A rather than the chat functions to send your questions. Did I get that right, Scott? All right, cool. So looking forward to Dr. Hoskins' thoughts and reflections about Dr. Cobb's talk, but he'll go first, and his talk is entitled On the Virtue of Hope and the Vice of Despair. Let's welcome Aaron.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak again here at King. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say a little bit, there's a little bit of an audible from what I had planned to say, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this painting. Bernard already said a little bit about it, but there's actually two images. This won't come clear exactly here, but the first one is the one that was used for the conference brochure. And you'll notice its colors are lighter, it's brighter, the figure is more prominent. The second one was more popularly known, and it was because the first one hung in a private gallery and the second one was given to the public. And you'll notice it's a softer tones, darker tones, gloomy feel. There's, if you look closely on the second image, and I encourage you to go do this on your own when you'll be able to see it a little bit better. There's a star in the one on the left and it's absent, and the one on the right. And it's this second one that was most popularly known. Chesterton, P.K. Chesterton, writes about this image, and he says the following: suppose a spectator found himself in the presence of a dim canvas, a bowed and stricken and secretive figure, captured for a broken lyre in the twilight. What would he think? His first thought, of course, would be that the picture was called Despair. His second, when he discovered his error in the catalog, that it had been entered under the wrong number. His third, that the painter was mad. But if we imagine that he overcame these preliminary feelings and that as he stared at that twilight picture, a dim and powerful sense of meaning began to grow on him, what would he see? He would see something for which there is neither speech nor language, which has been too vast for mind to see and too secret for a religion to utter, even as an esoteric doctrine. Standing before that picture, he finds himself in the presence of a great truth. He perceives that there is something in man that is always apparently on the eve of disappearing, but never disappears. An assurance which is always apparently saying farewell, and yet literally lingers. A string which is always stretched to snapping, and yet never snaps. He perceives that the most delicate thing in us, the most fragile, the most fantastic, is in truth the backbone and indestructible. He knows a great moral fact, that there was never an age of assurance, that there never was an age of faith. Faith is always at a disadvantage. It is a perpetually defeated thing which survives all its conquerors. No one can name this picture properly, but Watts, who painted it, has named it hope. So that's Chesterton. Another person who commented on this painting, and that was MLK Jr. in a sermon eventually titled Shattered Dreams, originally preached at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, as Unfulfilled Hopes. And here's King. And by the way, this is commentary on a little line in St. Paul's letter to the Romans about where Paul says, I hope to make it to Spain. So he's in Rome, he hopes to make it to Spain. And this is MLK. He says, our sermon today brings us face to face with one of the most agonizing problems of human experience. Very few, if any of us, are able to see all of our hopes fulfilled. So many of the hopes and promises of our mortal days are unrealized. There is much truth in George Frederick Watts's imaginative portrayal of hope in his picture entitled Hope. He depicts hope as seated atop our planet, but her head is sadly bowed and her fingers are plucking one unbroken harpstring. Who has not had to face the agony of blasted hopes and shattered dreams? So for Chesterton, the poem reveals a truth about hope. For King, the painting speaks to the experiences of lost hopes. And he goes on to say that life seems to have this fatal flaw, namely, we all die not having received what was promised. Our dreams are constantly tossed and blown by the staggering winds of disappointment. Right? He exhorts the congregation not to turn to bitterness or detachment or a number of other negative attitudes, and instead to develop capacity to accept the finite disappointment and yet cling to the infinite hope. So I've drawn this line from Watts to Chesterton to MLK in part to illustrate the complexity of hope in context of struggle and sorrow. We often think of hope as something light, something positive, something uplifting, something like Emily Dickinson's portrayal of hope in her famous poem, where she writes, hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity asked a crumb of me. So with all due respect, many find hope difficult. It asks more than a crumb, some. And this brings me to the poem that I really want to use to start today's talk, and that's a poem titled Dark Testament by the civil rights activist Polly Murray. This poem, if you read it in its entirety, you can actually listen to it if it's on the internet and available. The author reads it herself. It's a horrible poem that traces the horrors of slavery and the slave trade among other evils. It starts with this phrase: freedom is a dream, haunting as amber wine or worlds remembered out of time. Not Eden's gate, but freedom lures us down a trail of skulls where men forever crush the dreamers, never the dream. But in that poem, she interrupts a painful recounting with this refrain about hope that you see pictured. Hope is a crushed stalk between clenched fingers. Hope is a bird's wing broken by a stone. Hope is a word in a tuneless ditty, a word whispered with the wind, a dream of 40 acres and a mule, a cabin of one's own and a moment to rest, a name and a place for one's children and children's children at last. Hope is a song in a weary throat. She continues. Give me a song of hope and a world where I can sing it. Give me a song of faith and a people to believe in it. Give me a song of kindliness and a country where I can live it. Give me a song of hope and love and a brown girl's heart to hear it. Murray's poem is arresting. It speaks to the darkness of a world in which hope seems unimaginable, and to the powerful value of hope in just such a world. So this is an interdisciplinary conference, and today we started with a painting and 2 poems. I've been invited today to give a general vocabulary to frame our conversations. My task is to articulate an account of the virtue of hope and its competing vice of despair. And I've been asked to do so in a way that can inform our attempts to grapple with obstacles to hope and temptations to despair, especially those endemic to healthcare settings. I've been asked to think about hope. In asking me to do this, it's a recognition of the fact that I've been thinking about hope for about 10 years now. And that started as Regan mentioned, with reflections on the death of my son, who he lived for 5 hours. He was born with trisomy 18 and struggled to live. We had an amazing experience welcoming into our family, experiencing the great care of effectively a perinatal hospice program. Throughout the time, he was diagnosed early in the pregnancy. Throughout that time of the pregnancy, we were cared by our community, carried well. They allowed us to grieve and to experience the joy of welcoming him. And it's that experience that got me really thinking about the virtue of hope and the ways in which it can sustain individuals through what you think of as hopeless situations. That turned into a research project to develop an account of the value of perinatal hospice programs that is informed by virtue ethics. And in the process of doing that, what I argued is that perinatal hospice programs enact virtues that tend to profound needs that families experience in situations, one of which is the need for hope. So what I want to do today is talk about hope in general, talk about its opposing vice of despair, and then towards the end of the talk, discuss what I take to be one of the main obstacles to hope, and that is communities who fail to provide a loving space for families who are suffering. So what's driving this is, if you want to deal with the obstacles to hope and temptation, you have to look beyond individuals and toward their communities. As Kathy Weingarten writes, hope is something we do with others. Hope is too important, its effects on body and soul too significant to be left to individuals alone. Hope must be the responsibility of the community. So that's the framework. So to do so, I'm going to start with a sketch, and I'm going to use Murray's poem as a way of providing a foundation for thinking about the virtue. I'm going to highlight a few things that I see in the poem that I think are important to understanding the virtue of. Then I'll give a more formal analysis, and because I'm a philosopher, this is going to be 30 minutes of distinctions, and just bear with me through that part. The hope, again, for that section is to provide vocabulary for us to think about obstacles to hope. And one key feature of this distinction is I'm going to draw a distinction between hopelessness as an experience and the vice of despair. And so that will be a key portion of that. And then finally, I'll deal with what I take to be these obstacles to hope. So let's go through Murray's poem in a little bit more detail. The first thing I want to note about Murray's poem is that the virtue of hope involves a desire for outcomes that are in fact good. So there's a longing component to hope, but then what we long for is in fact good. It's not a virtue of hope if what we long for is evil, or the virtue of hope involves the desire for outcomes that are in fact good. In the poem, what are the objects? A dream of 40 acres and a mule, a cabin of one's own and a moment to rest, a name and place for one's children and children's children at last. Notice desire for economic freedom, for a home, for space to rest, for the endless toil of slavery, for identity, for family, for a sense of legacy. These are real, important, substantive goods, so long denied to those who were enslaved. That the hopes to which she points are not merely good outcomes for one individual, they're hopes for others as well. She longs for a world in which children experience the fulfillment of hopes so long denied in previous generations. So that's the first thing to note. Hope involves a desire or a longing for outcomes that are in fact good. Second, the outcomes are difficult to obtain. And you hear this in the words of the poem. You hear it in the phrase, hope is a song in a weary throat, right? The person has been singing this song for a long time. The outcomes haven't been realized yet. There's a sense in which we can't count on the realization of those outcomes. They depend for their realization on factors beyond the person's control. We hear this, I think, especially in that second part of that refrain where she's engaged in petitions. She's, give me a song of hope, give me a song of faith, give me a song of kindliness, right? She's requesting, she's pleading. And there's a recognition here that she can't bring about these outcomes on her own. She's dependent upon the goodness of others. This leads me to a third point, and that is hope is a deeply social trait. We are often unable to hope for things on our own. We're dependent upon others for our capacities to hope. We have to receive it as a gift because we're not capable of mustering the will to have hope on our own. For those hopes most difficult to obtain and those circumstances that erode our abilities to see a hopeful outcome, we're dependent upon others to help sustain us in hope. So often, life places us in a posture of dependence on a goodness beyond ourselves. So, the first point I said was hope is a virtue of longing for things that are outcomes that are in fact good. Hope involves a longing for goods that are difficult to obtain. That was the second point. This third point is that hope is not just a virtue of longing, it's a virtue of leaning on the goodness of others. Fourth, hope is something of value. A world in which there is no hope is a bleak world. When you read this poem, you see that darkness from country's origin through the slave trade. You see its effect on a people. And it's a world that's bleak, but still there is in Murray's poem this longing for hope, this longing for something that's good. Hope is something to be desired, even if it might not be realized in the space of one's own life. If not for oneself, we hope for future generations. We long for their good, and we include within this good their own ability to hope. So in short, I think Murray's poem highlights some of the key dimensions of the virtue of hope that I hope to describe in just a minute. One, it involves desire. Two, it involves a desire for real goods. Third, it involves a desire for real goods that are difficult to obtain. And then fourth, it is a deeply social trait. So, the formal analysis portion. Here are the distinctions. I like to make distinctions. So here we go. Virtues are excellences of character. They're not just behaviors, right? They are settled states of our character that dispose us to feel and to think and to act with characteristic patterns in relevant circumstances. Vices, of course, are opposed to virtues in the sense that they are also settled states of character that dispose a person to the opposite patterns. In traditional Aristotelian ethics, we tend to think of virtues being flanked by vices on either side. If you look at traditional discussions of the virtue of hope, what you'll see is it's traditional to say that the virtue of hope is flanked by two vices. One, the vice of despair, and the second, the vice of presumption. I'm going to focus my talk today primarily on the vice of despair. If you have thoughts, if you have questions about presumption, I can say a little bit about that later. But the point here is that virtues are settled states of character. They're acquired over time through repeated practice. In theological circles, the theological virtue is not an acquired virtue in that sense. It's an infused virtue. So it's a gift of grace given to the person by God that enables them to long for union with God and lean on Christ as the means through which one comes into union with God. Right? So virtues are excellences of character. They perfect the person and they are conducive to flourishing. Between virtues and vices are a range of traits, mixed traits that fall along a spectrum. So if I'm drawing from the points above, we can say that the virtue of hope as a moral virtue is a well-tuned disposition that manifests itself in characteristic patterns of feeling, thought, and activity concerning outcomes that are good, possible, and difficult to secure. Right? So that's a formal definition of the virtue of hope. But I think it's important to distinguish that from several things. So first of all, the virtue of hope is not just an episodic state or an emotion or feeling. It's acquired disposition. So here's one quick way to see the difference between a natural hope that's an episodic feeling and the virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas notes that episodic feelings of hope are common to drunkards and to youth, right? And so those are not virtues, right? The virtue of hope is something that's a settled state of character that gives rise to hopeful feelings in specific circumstances, but it's not the same thing as just that episodic feeling of hope. And it's not just a natural feeling of hope that you have for some outcome. Another thing to note here is we have hopes for all sorts of things. So my son is going to play a tennis match this weekend in a tournament, and I have hopes that his opponent will lose. That's not a good thing. I want him to win, but the hope, the desire to is not a good thing for me, right? So that kind of hope, it doesn't target something that it's a feeling that I have. It's episodic state. It is not the same thing as a virtue, because remember, virtues must target real goods, not just apparent goods, and certainly not evils. Right? I think it's also important to distinguish between the virtue of hope as a disposition and an untutored hopefulness. So you might think of people who are hopeful, but they have this hopefulness in a way that's not necessarily virtuous. So one way to think about that distinction, to think about that type of hopefulness, is it can target the wrong sorts of things. So you can be hopeful, you can have this disposition of hopefulness that can target all sorts of bad things. So that can't be the virtue. Another way to think about it as a disposition that's not necessarily virtuous is that an inner state of hopefulness, even if it targets the right sorts of things, can be unmeasured or immoderate in all sorts of ways. So it can lead you to cling to things that you ought to relinquish. It can lead you to pursue things in an immoderate way. It could sometimes, a hopefulness, a disposition which is not virtuous, might lead you to abandon things too quickly. So virtue of hope needs to be properly measured. I should say this differently. The disposition of hope is virtuous only if it's properly measured. That is, well tuned to the real world possibilities that you're facing. So to make that a little clearer, I think it's helpful to think about related anticipatory appraisals. And here I think it's really helpful to contrast the virtuous expression of hope with other anticipatory states like optimism, confident expectation, or on the other side, pessimism, fearful expectation, or resignation. So I want to spend just a little bit of time distinguishing between the expression of virtuous hope and those other anticipatory appraisals. So take the optimist. The optimist assumes that all will be well, displays a generalized sense of positivity about the future, such that the outcome's realization seems utterly secure. It's frankly guaranteed. So it's a generalized sense that all will be well. Confident expectation is more particular, I think. It's involved a similar security about the future, but it's about a particular good. And virtuous hope lacks both that general sense of assurance characteristic of optimism, as well as that particular sense of security characteristic of confident expectation. The hopeful person is always attuned to the fact that his hopes may be disappointed. Consider the other side. Pessimism, fearful expectation, and resignation. All of these are rooted in a felt assurance of defeat. So the person who feels pessimistic about the future adopts a general stance of assured defeat towards desires. Fearful expectancy expresses itself in assurance that some particular desire has already been defeated. And given that fear, the person often recoils from that assumed loss. Resignation may not involve the same type of recoiling, but it does involve the sense that loss is a foregone conclusion. The hopeful person, by contrast, anticipates the real possibility of achieving or realizing a desired good. he does not countenance this assurance of assumed loss. So on the one hand, the optimist and the person with confident expectation assumes that the realization of the good is secure. On the other hand, the pessimist, the fearfully expectant, and the person who's resigned assumes loss. The hopeful person does neither of those things. They're attuned to the fact that their hopes may be disappointed, but also attuned to the fact that their hopes may be realized. So I think this illustrates an important dimension of hope's characteristic affective expression. It has a mixed emotional valence. I think that Watts painting shows it well, right? On the one hand, you've got this desolate figure in the midst of what is apparently so sad, blinded, right? But on the other hand, she still bows her head to hear music that she can imagine, the harp, right? There's a sense of a mixed emotional valence there. So on the one hand, virtuous hope expresses itself as in a positive construal and an anticipation of a realization of an important, though difficult to obtain good. On the other hand, it involves a characteristic sensitivity to limits and a susceptibility to loss. The person with the virtue of hope is attentive, both to the vulnerable position he occupies and to the possible good of realizing this important outcome. More than that, the affective responses to the vulnerable position he occupies are tethered to proper estimation of the prospects of realizing his hopes. He feels no sense of entitlement concerning its realization. If it comes to fruition, he experiences joy and gratitude. If circumstances prevent its realization, he'll experience disappointment, but he'll react with the same type of anger or resentment or distrust that he would if he were assured of its realization. Furthermore, his sensitivity keeps the hopeful person's mind alert and attentive to signs of its realization or ways through and around obstacles to its realization. It also creates an imaginative ability to reframe or forge hopes when loss becomes inevitable. And here I'm going to break off script for just a minute because I think our experience with perinatal hospice programs is a good example of that case. So often when families receive adverse prenatal diagnoses, they're told they're in a hopeless situation and there's nothing they can do. But families in these circumstances often receive a diagnosis 20 weeks into the pregnancy. It's a desired pregnancy. They've already bonded with the child. And there are a wide range of hopes that are available to these families if people can imagine what it might look like. And so what structured perinatal hospice programs do is they provide a repertoire of hope for families to invest themselves in. Hopes to spend time with the child, hopes to have the child baptized and surrounded within the community, hopes to welcome the child into their family. In some cases, hopes to bring the child home and introduce them to their family. Right? These are a wide range of hopes available to families that so often in after a prenatal diagnosis, the counselors and physicians forget to mention. Right? Perinatal hospice programs provide that repertoire to that family. Right? So hope, or the virtue of hope, can enable the imagining of new hopes that are tethered to the original values, even if they're not the same type of hope. Let me say just a little bit about hopelessness and despair. We often use these words interchangeably, and I think there is a sense in which they can be used interchangeably, but I think it's also very important to distinguish between hopelessness as a felt experience and the vice of despair as a character trait. So a generalized sense of hopelessness might be a sense that the world, that there are no goods available. And often I think people get to this point in their lives where there is nothing for which they could hope. They can't see the world cooperating with their desires. But that's not the same thing as despair. So the vice of despair, remember, it's a character trait. It's an entrenched state, moves beyond a general sense of resignation to the adoption of a negative attitude that there's something positively aligned against the person. In other words, the despairing agent moves beyond resignation, beyond the sense of hopelessness, to the resolution that the good is not could not possibly be attained. And then he acts in accordance with that stance. There's an evaluative commitment here. The agent with the vice of despair is resolute in his commitment to the impossibility of securing good outcomes. That implicit commitment to the impossibility of realizing a desired good makes the despairing person resistant to their possible realization. There's a stubbornness or intransigence, a fixity implicit in this disposition that skews the landscape of perceived possibility. His construal of what is possible reflects a narrow and fixed picture that his underlying commitment affords. As a result of that constricted stance, the despairing person forfeits the ongoing pursuit of outcomes he desires. He no longer seeks out or strains toward their realization. He willingly gives up pursuit because he's committed to their inevitable defeat. Despair is not mere resignation or feelings of sorrow over the recognition that there will be unfulfilled hopes. Despair is a dispositional resistance to the possibility of realizing the good. I think it's important just to emphasize this one last time. Hopelessness may be the outcome of a series of horrible circumstances, but it's not the same thing as a commitment to the impossibility of realizing goods. The vice of despair involves this sort of commitment. And this is why, I think to go back to the painting analogy, it would be as if the woman simply places the harp down and walks away. Right? So she have good reasons for hopelessness in this context. She strains to hear music. Despair would involve merely putting the harp away, putting the lyre away, and abandoning that quest. So let's talk about some obstacles, hope, and temptations to despair. I think there's good reason to see hope as a facilitating disposition. It energizes pursuits. It endows a person with resilience, fortitude, and patience. It anchors us to values our hopes express. It buoys us up in difficulty. As Richard Lazarus writes, it's a vital coping resource in conditions that tempt to despair. But hope is a highly fragile capacity. This is the point that Chesterton makes, that one string is stretched to its breaking point, but it doesn't quite break, right? It's fragile. Hope always carries with it the acknowledgement of the potential for disappointment. There can be no guarantees that the objects of one's hopes will be realized. Beyond the disappointment of specific hopes, we can lose a basic orientation of hopefulness. Daily struggle against adversity can slowly erode a person's capacity for hopeful agency. Acute forms of suffering can instantly shatter our abilities to hope well. And this is not just this sense that some outcome is foreclosed, but life may bring a person to the point where they think that all good possibilities in the future have been foreclosed. As Margaret Urban Walker writes, if you want to destroy people or a people, you can take away those things on which hope most depends, especially those things that show there is a future they can value. So hope is a facilitating disposition. It's a highly fragile capacity, and hopelessness itself is a significant threat. Hopelessness can damage human agency in profound ways. It can alter our perspective. It can challenge our ability to see value in life. The deepest forms of hopelessness can permanently damage or hinder capacities. It can precipitate actions that are contrary to our good. It can lead to psychological of self-harm. Whether or not a person can sustain hope is not just a matter of their interior dispositions, it's a matter of their circumstances. And perhaps most damaging in this context is the way hope can undermine a capacity for trust. So, what does this? Given hope's important facilitating role and for well-being, its vulnerability is a significant cause for moral concern. Failures to perceive, to appreciate, and to seek to remediate a person's hopelessness are failures to respond to a significant other regarding moral task. Tending to the hopes of others is a fundamental component of care for persons. This is especially the case when it forces the distinction in drawing between hopelessness as an experience and the evaluative stance of despair. Those who are hopeless now may discover the ability to hope again. I'm going to argue next that they can do so in part because of the care of their communities. And therefore, if communities lack care, this places a person in a very dangerous position. I think in our present moment, one of the greatest obstacles to hope is the lack of communities who are, that our communities are insufficiently attuned to the sorrow in our midst. We're not sensitive to the profound need for hope because many of our communities are inhospitable to those who are suffering. We live in communities that demand individual grit, resilience, attitudes, an optimistic outlook on the future. Suffering, we're anxious about suffering. And so because of that, many of our communities look for ways to distract ourselves from suffering. Rather than creating spaces where sufferers are welcomed, where we can engage in proper rituals of lament and expressions of grief, where we can engage in acts of hoping for and with others, we seek to anest ourselves from the difficulties and sorrows so many face. As a result, the danger of losing all hope, do not find a communal ethos of care for their needs. It's amazing what a good community can do. It's also very sad what communities that require of suffering people that they either not talk, or that if they talk, that they provide a positive spin at the end of their conversations due to families and to individuals who are in danger of losing all hope. Addressing the profound need for hope requires more than individual grit or resilience. It requires a loving community. So let me bring this to a close. I think what is needed to address hopelessness, temptations, despair in these contexts is a caring community. We need communal spaces where people can receive hope as a gift. There are many through no fault of their own, cannot muster the will to hope on their own. Those for whom hope is most difficult are often those for whom hope is a most pressing need. Within caring communities, individuals in this position can depend upon the hopeful care of others. They can allow the hopes of the community to substitute for their own hope. Addressing the threats of hopelessness and the temptation to despair requires developing communities in which individuals do not have to rely on their own reserves of hope. So I want to conclude this talk by bookending it with a poem. And this was one I wrote after the death of my son. It was a reflection on our community, a community that enabled us to grieve well and to receive the gift of hope in the midst of loss. I think these words give form to both the need for hope and the way caring communities can enable those in need of hope to hope again. The background picture, for what it's worth, is a picture from Rwanda, where I grew up, and it's a picture of an old ambulance, just to say 4 men carrying a stretcher to a hospital. So here's the poem. It was the image I had in mind. Hope is the stretcher on which we lay broken. It is the space between which contains us. It is the cot carried by strong hands along difficult roads. Hope holds us. Hope bears us along. Hope carries us. Hope is in their hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb, for your beautiful distinctions between hope and despair. I really appreciated them. I also want to thank Dr. Bernard Prusak for inviting me to this conference. Can folks hear me? I'm gonna have to keep leaning over. There we go. Is that better? Thank you so much for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. This is my first time out here at Wilkes-Barre, really. And so it's been great just to be around a group of wonderful people. Thank you to my colleague, Dr. Christian Crocus, for extending the invitation to me to come here as well. So I want to draw on some of the nuanced differences. Well, let's start with this. I'm appreciative, Dr. Cobb, for you drawing out some of the nuanced differences between hope and despair. I am especially thrilled that you use Polly Murray's work. For those who don't know who Polly Murray is, she is a Black feminist queer Episcopal priest, the first Black woman to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. She's also a civil rights leader and an attorney. She famously coined the phrase Jane Crow to bring attention to particular ways women were discriminated against through our legal systems and social structures. She is an incredibly important figure across multiple fields and disciplines, and someone who is often overlooked. So I appreciate you bringing her into focus here and for grounding your work in her poem. And I think you did so in interesting ways. Your analysis of hope and despair especially lends itself to its individual and personal relationships. And that was the first time I thought about Murray's work in that way. So you've given me a lot to think about. My response, I hope, builds and expands some of your points that you've made, but also shifts our lens to talk about hope and despair in terms of systems and structures and history. What I hope to do is ground more of Murray's poem in the particular realities that she was pointing to, and to give some more context, flesh the life that she was talking about. So when I'm talking about when enfleshment, it means give some more cultural, social, historical background so that what we're looking at is not people generally, but a particular group of people she's talking about. I'm gonna highlight bring in some Black theology, maybe a little bit of Black studies. I think they shift our thinking about the categorical distinctions between hope as a virtue and despair as a vice. And I want to be clear that I'm not offering a solution. I'm what I'm doing is complexifying it more, if that's possible. And so be okay with the complexity, sit in it. So Murray's poem, Dark Testament, is a book-length poem. And as Dr. Cobb mentioned, it's a dark testament, it's dark. She begins the poem describing in detail the violence of conquest and Native American genocide perpetuated by white European Christians. She then describes in detail the violence of conquest of African peoples being violently taken from their land and placed in the belly of a slave ship. This violence also perpetrated by white European Christians. She poetically and vividly tells a story of deep, deep despair. She writes, "O Black warrior, hurl a dark spear of song, born on a night wind, piercing the sorrow-haunted darkness, perpetual cycle of grief, cruel legacy of endless betrayal, frenzied anger beating against the impenetrable walls of silence, tethered beneath a slave ship's girth. The hours throbbed with dying and birth, foaming and champing and slime and dung, rumbling curses in the jungle tongue, torturous withering of limbs that burst, whimpering children choked with thirst, vomiting milk from curdled breasts, rats' teeth sinking and sucking chests, slave ships plunging through westing waves, grinding proud men to cringing slaves. So the poem moves along with history from the violence of conquest into scenes of chattel slavery. That is, into the violence of Christian settler colonizers who, after creating the conditions of despair, also create the conditions of hope by offering a white God to the slave. It is only from this context, contradiction, tension, that we can understand what Murray means by hope. She writes, Black man down on his knees in the swamp grass, sent his prayer straight to the white God's throne, built him a faith, built him a bridge to God, and God gave him a hope and the power of song. She goes on to say, hope is a crushed stalk beneath the clenched fingers. Hope is a bird's wing broken by stone. Hope is a word in a tuneless ditty, a word whispered with the wind, a dream of 40 acres and a mule, a cabin of one's own in a moment to rest, a name and place for one's children and children's children at last. Hope is a song in a weary throat. For Murray, the song of hope that the white person's God gave to Black people was violent. A crushed stalk, clenched like a fist in one's fingers. The song of hope that the white person's God gave to Black people was like having wings to fly, but those wings were clipped and broken. Hope was a promise of reparations that never came, 40 acres and a mule. It was a promise of a place to call home and a place for your children. The song of hope that the white person's God gave to Black people was a song in a weary, tired, might I add, despaired throat. She concludes her statement on hope in that section of the poem with a demand for us for how to make hope real. She writes, give me a song of hope and a world where I can actually sing it. Give me a song of faith and a people who are going to believe in it. Give me a song of kindliness and a country where I can actually live in it. Give me a song of hope and love and a brown girl's heart to hear it. Murray's poem demands that we cannot think of hope outside dominating theological and philosophical notions that kept Black people in perpetual despair. Hope cannot be divorced from the dominating powers that have at the same time created the condition for Black people to even need hope to begin with. Murray's poem is a critique of hope. It's a critique of hope, particularly Christian hope, that oftentimes makes itself a virtue when it's really a vice. What Murray is helping us see is that maybe what we need is more than hope. Hope is exhausting. It has grown weary in the throats of Black people. Maybe what we need is to change the conditions that continue to create despair in the first place. If Murray were writing this poem today, perhaps she would have highlighted the forced sterilizations many Black women experience while visiting their doctors for routine checkups. Maybe she would have highlighted Black women that they have the highest rate of pregnancy-related death in the United States, along with Native American women, and how 60% of those pregnancy-related deaths are preventable. Perhaps she would have highlighted how Black mothers consistently undergo cesareans more than white mothers, even in low-risk situations. And as a result, we are more likely to suffer for longer after birth, struggle to fully recover, as some of us die. And I imagine that if she were writing this poem today, that she would have shown the connection between those results and how cesarean sections came from experiments performed on enslaved women in the South If Murray were writing this poem today, perhaps she would have highlighted climate and environmental grief that Black and brown communities have been experiencing for over 50 years because of disproportionate amounts of toxic waste pollution intentionally dumped in their communities. How Black children have been plagued with asthma, multiple cancers in Black communities. Perhaps she would have mentioned all of this in her poem today. But it would be wrong to assume that just because Murray highlights ways in which Black people live in a constant state of despair, or just because she critiques hope, that does not mean she has no hope. It is, as Black theologian James Cone notes, that the dialectic of sorrow and joy and despair and hope were central to the Black experience. For Cone, Black communities, Black churches, Black music created a different kind of hope for Black people. Reflecting on the blues, he wrote that blues singers lifted African Americans above their troubles by offering them an opportunity to experience love and loss at the same time. He notes that on the one hand, African American people spoke of how they cried and moaned about feeling like nothing, like something thrown away. The next line, they balanced despair and hope. Cone reveals the necessity of hope that visibilizes despair, that doesn't try to pretend that despair does not exist. Black hope, Cone notes, had to be carved out of the wretched conditions, out of the world where the possibility of violent death was always imminent. What I'm suggesting here through Cone and Murray is a demand for a more critical hope. A hope that does not recognize a history of genocide and enslavement and manifestations of systematic injustices as a result of that. A hope that does not speak to the wretched conditions of an always imminent violent death cannot be considered hope at all. It is a word in a tuneless ditty, Murray says. And so perhaps contrary to Dr. Cobb's claims that despair is absence of hope, what I think we need to think about hope and despair inextricably connected in our history. I just realized I'm missing a whole paper of my presentation. So I will end there. I had lots more comments too about your piece about proximity. And maybe I'll speak just kind of off the wing there. My final thoughts about your presentation were about how to care for others who are in despair. I found your hope by proxy interesting. Someone hopes for the other when they cannot hope for themselves. By hoping in place of the other, this person recovers the other capacity to hope. You write that part of her hope on his behalf is the active search for outcomes that are worthy of his hope. And her hope acts as a kind of proxy for his hopes. They are an effectively charged relational scaffolding for the recovery of his capacity to hope. And so what I heard you saying is, so when you are in a state of despair, someone can come in and proxy hope for you when you cannot hope. And it made me think of conversations we've had in studies about empathy. And empathy, if we go with the common definition, to step in someone's shoes, right? To feel what they feel, to be a proxy for that person's feelings. And it's interesting and it's hard. And I think about this in a very famous Christian abolitionist named John Rankin. He's very famous for helping with the Underground Railroad. And he is writing to his brother, who actually is pro-slavery. And he's trying to convince his brother to not have slaves anymore. And he tries to do it by way of empathy. And he says to his brother, and part of John Rankin's issue is that people are not outraged at the sight of the slave trade, at the sight of Black people in chains walking to the auction block. They're not outraged by this because they haven't brought slavery enough to them, right? So he writes to his brother, and these things later get published. And he says, I want to bring slavery close to you, right? And so he says, now imagine, to bring slavery close, you have to put yourself in their position. Imagine, so he says to him, imagine me, my wife and kids are the slaves, and we're walking in chains, and we're being beaten and whipped and spit on. And so he's trying to put himself in the place of the slave to get his brother to imagine the horror. So his brother then empathizes, and then the moral outcome comes out of that is that he is no longer pro-slavery. The problem with that is that to put yourself in someone else's shoes, feel their feelings, you're only just feeling your own. John Rankin was only feeling his own feelings. He could not possibly have imagined. The second issue with it is it performs a double ontological negation of the slave, right? The slave's existence, the slave cannot exist for Rankin to be present, right? The slave can no longer exist so that Rankin can feel the feelings. And my thoughts about that is hope proxy do the same thing. Kind of incarnational thinking that's grounded in Christianity, right? God sends Jesus into the world, and Jesus feels the suffering of the world. And by proxy, God also feels the suffering of the world. But to what extent are we also trying to replicate and be like God? How has that become problematic in our ways to think hope and despair? And so those are my sort of thoughts. It just complexifies the issues when we have racialized bodies, gendered bodies, a history that is built on such despair. And so I wanted to just offer those thoughts to complexify these terms even more. What if your actual being in the world is based on despair? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that response. I'm not sure, Bernard, do you want to open the questions? Would you like me to respond briefly to that, or?
Respond briefly.
Okay, perfect. So first, I want to thank Dr. Hoskins. There's so much that I want to just say, yeah, it's much more complex than the talk that I gave can represent. I think there's some commonality in what we're pointing to. And I think if I can go back to, oops, sorry. Let me go back to the poem. So this part of the poem, I think I want to highlight the commonality in what we're saying is this is a prayer in a sense, right? So the part of the poem that precedes this section talks about the Black man on his knees in the swamps praying to the white man's God for hope. And then the point that Dr. Hoskins is mentioning is this second line, and a world where I can live it, and a people to believe in it, and a country where I can live it, and a brown girl's heart to hear it. These are structural things. And I think the point of commonality in our discussion is, for me, when you're talking about hope as a virtue, it's too much to require of individuals because life is often too complicated and too difficult. What we need are structural remedies. And for me, the structural remedies are communities that can help stem the slide from hopelessness to the evaluative stance of despair, right? That evaluative stance of despair is an individual willful response to what are often horrendous circumstances. And what I'm trying to point to is communities that can help prevent that slide from the experience of hopelessness to the evaluative stance of despair. And I think that's very hard. I think that's very hard in these contexts. The type of despair that grounds Dark Testament as a poem, and what Dr. Hoskins rightly emphasizes is a despair that's in many ways created by systems and structures. The only way, I can't imagine that despair being ended with a structural or systemic response. And so the point of my talk, the conclusion of my talk, is if we really want to address obstacles to hope or temptations to despair, we need more than individual callings to people to be more hopeful. And instead, we need communities that are committed to helping stem the slide from hopelessness to a stance of despair. So that will be my response. And then I'm not sure how much time we have questions, but
Time, 10 minutes or so. And if you'd ask your question using the mic, so come on over. And I want to encourage people on Zoom, send your questions through the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get those questions into the mix.
So my question to you is, this manifestation of despair in this country, the 10th leading cause of death is suicide. In your opinion, do you feel as a nation that we are moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction?
it depends on whether suicide rates are decreasing or increasing. I think that would be my initial response. If they're increasing, then we're not heading in the right direction, right? There are some in the philosophical literature who look at suicide as an expression of hope, right? Because this is at least something meaningful I can do with a life that's completely lacking in meaning. So there are some people who argue that suicide can be a hopeful act. I view suicide is not a hopeful act. Often understandable why many feel compelled to commit suicide. And I don't know, other than to address the communities in which these individuals are embedded, I'm not sure how else to address that. It's quite clear that they no longer see value in their life. And I think the hopeful response to this is to find ways for communities to help individuals recapture a sense that there's value in their life, even if they can't yet see it. So that's not a satisfactory answer to a really complex question, but I don't see hopefulness. I don't see suicide as an act of hope in that context. I see it as a sign that one has abandoned the project of hope. Right? And I think, again, the response is a communal response. Do you have a response to that? Okay. Can you come to the mic?
Hi, your word community seems to be doing a lot of work in your talk. Because it can mean anything from, anything slightly larger family to all of society. So maybe if you can talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yes, community does a lot of work. And I don't have sometimes it works by pointing. And so in the perinatal hospice context, what I'm talking about there, when I'm talking about communal structures, I'm talking about the team, the interdisciplinary team of physicians, nurses, chaplains, and whatever, anybody involved in the care of the family whose child is expected to die shortly after birth. Right. So in that sense, a community is this hodgepodge of people of moving parts, but who are invested in the care of that family in that hospital setting. It also extends out beyond that to the families and the friends of the family and their communities. I don't have a well worked out sense of community as a whole, but I do think that we have a sense in which there are social groups that are important to us. Some of these social groups are longstanding and go throughout our lives. Other social groups are temporary. So in our family situation, in the context of perinatal hospice, there was a team of physicians and nurses who cared for us. They were part of our community in that context. They supported our hopes in ways that we wouldn't have imagined at the outset after diagnosis, because the initial diagnosis of Sam's condition came with 5 minutes afterwards. There was a choice. You can do nothing or you can terminate the pregnancy. That was the choice. And so we left and we went to my wife's obstetrician, who helped craft a plan with us for caring for our son. She became an integral part of our community in that context. So I don't have a well worked out answer to the communal, what a community is, but I do think I can point to instances where there are communities that sustain people in hope, that can help imagine possibilities that the individuals wouldn't have conceived in those contexts in what appeared hopeless situations.
Hi, thanks for your comments. I should be talking about something not so abstract after Dr. Hoskins' very powerful response, but I have a question. It seems to me that what you're almost saying, maybe you're saying, but you're not saying straight out, is that despair isn't the absence of hope, it's the rejection of hope, at least in the Catholic tradition. So you're not just taking one thing, rejecting that, you're almost rejecting everything. And you are putting yourself maybe not at odds with the community, but you're putting yourself outside the community on the basis of that rejection, and the community can respond with empathy, with help. But it seems that, at least in the Christian, virtue of hope, that it's a more fundamental issue than the way you seem to be describing it.
So I would endorse what you just said. I see despair as a vice, as a character trait that involves rejection of goods that are possible for a person. Now, I would distinguish between vice of despair and feelings of despair, in the same way that I would distinguish between the virtue of hope and feelings of hope. I think feelings of despair are common. In fact, I think feelings of hopelessness are common. I don't think those are the same thing as a vice involves a willful rejection from a character, right? So this is part of the reason why I was trying to, and searching for a better way to do this, distinguish between hopelessness as a sense, a feeling, and the vice of despair. I think it's similar here in what Dr. Hoskins said is, despair is common. But in that sense, I think what we're talking about despair there are these overwhelming sense of lost possibilities that might be recovered, right? Whereas the vice of despair issues in a settled evaluative commitment against the possibility of any kind of good whatsoever. This is why I think I read Murray's poem as very dark and bleak. I just keep coming. I've read this constantly for the past few months, and I just keep coming back to that refrain. On the one hand, she's right that a particular type of hope is a tuneless ditty. I really think the contrast between Vincent's poem and this poem is really stark. If you hold them up against each other, hope is the thing with feathers. Hope is a bird's crushed, right? It's it's quite clear to me that there's a connection here. But there's still at root here this sense that there might be a hope available. Like, she's still longing for these goods. She hasn't rejected the possibility of the goods. She just sees that it requires a different type of world than the one presently. Right. So in King's, let me go back to King. So in the sermon he preaches at the end, he offers some possibilities, possible responses to unfulfilled hopes. And he catalogs several negative ones, one of which involves bitterness, another of which involves detachment or isolation, a third, a kind of fatalism. And then he contrasts that with what he takes to be the right response, which is an active and creative will that stands up even in the midst of unfulfilled hopes. And so it's not a rejection of hope. It's a clinging to the possibility, even in spite of the difficult and conditions that feel so awful and feel hopeless.
Okay. All right. Thanks again for both of your talks. And I really like about Dr. Hoskins said being a proxy for someone else's hopes. I'd like to ask this question through my lens as a healthcare provider and trying to be that community, as Dr. Cobb said, of creating hope or helping to come out of that despair. And maybe it's sometimes as healthcare providers, we're doing the right thing and trying to be empathetic or trying to solve everyone's problems, but maybe are causing more harm or more hopelessness or more despair. So from perspectives, either personal experience or from the philosophical or theological perspective, what are some practical things us as care providers can take to be part of that community and trying to facilitate that hope? That'd be for either of you or both of you.
I'll give you a break. I thought I started my talk with saying I had no solutions. I knew it. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to bear witness without the impulse to, and it's a well-intentioned impulse, empathy, and sometimes certain kinds of hope, without the impulse to put yourself in that person's situation so that you take on that feeling. That's violent. It can be violent, especially with patients of color. So I've been thinking about what it means to bear witness and to acknowledge what you're bearing witness to with a patient versus trying to be a proxy in a sense of take on someone's pain and even to hope for them. Because sometimes that hope that you have for me might be the 40 acres and a mule. It might be the home I've never gotten. It might be all of those things. So I think that that's what I can offer. Like sometimes our hopes do more harm. So, like the hope is it's the song and my throat is weary from thinking about how to sort of not die in a world. I think about my cousin who went to the ER. He lives in Alabama because he was in heart chest pains and he knew he was having a heart attack. And the nurse who saw him told him very flat out, "Oh, you're faking the pain." So then he had to go to another hospital which he was treated. And they said, "Oh my God, you're having a heart attack." And he was treated. Thank God he lived. But in his situation, it was very racialized. This Black guy, you can take on the pain. You're faking it. You're fine. Let's see somebody else. Let's go see this white patient. And Yeah, and I'm constantly thinking about situations like those that are just kind of personal, but also systematic, right? Like my personal body, his personal body is also this political body that we cannot escape. We cannot escape the, hope and despair at the same time at once. So anyway, this I'm digressing at this point. But I think I've been thinking about bearing witness and trying not to fully grasp, put yourself in the place of the other, but bear witness and the kind of I don't know, the kind of testimony that comes from that. And it's hard because people want to save people. Health professionals want to save people. And sometimes, well, sometimes, yeah, I'll just say that it's hard to not be the savior all the time. Yeah.
I just want to add, so this is, I think, right. So when I'm talking about hoping on others' behalf, I think the danger there, of course, is making my hopes for them, like trying to give them my hopes, right? Or trying to think, if I were in that situation, it's the thing I would hope for. And there is a sense in which you do not give to that person the space or the possibility to cultivate what they think of as a hopeful outcome. Do worry about that. I think there is a potential for violence there. What I'm thinking about here in this context on hope on others' behalf is really as a way of being for them, being for their good, and providing a loving space such that they can recover a capacity to imagine a good for themselves. I think physicians and healthcare providers in contexts of especially terminal or chronic illness sometimes there are dangers here in terms of there are several types of dangers. One of which is I need to come into the patient. I need to dismantle their hope for cure because cure is not possible. So what I have to do is make sure that they understand that they have to imagine different outcomes. So it's my job. I have a responsibility to make sure that they don't hope for the wrong thing here. And so sometimes there are cases, of course, where that kind of conversation needs to happen, but dismantling independent of providing a repertoire of other types of hopes that might be possible is a very dangerous thing for a person in that vulnerable state. The other type of danger, of course, is to imagine all sorts of possibilities that are hopeful, which are not consistent with what the patient values, the kinds of goods they want to achieve as they approach the end of their life. And so you can imagine physicians coming and saying, here's the range of experimental treatments that are available to you. They might have some success, they might not, but they're going to be really difficult for your body. Let's go ahead and push forward anyways, because it can extend your life by this many days or this many weeks or months or whatever. And that might be completely inconsistent with the person's, the way the person imagines the end of their life at the end of their life, and which would do violence to the kinds of hopes that the person might really want to realize, namely the hopes to be at home with family, their loving care, independent of all of the violent effects of this treatment. And so I do think there are dangers in the ways in which one might approach others who are in hopeless situations. And I think the goal here is to be for others in the right sort of way, to be for their good. And by listening and being present to them, there are issues that are relevant here that ought to modulate how one goes about engaging in the project of hoping on another's behalf. Those virtues include things like passion, solidarity, and all those sorts of things. But it starts by listening and being present to the person rather than coming in with a host of assumptions about what would be proper to them and their good at the moment.
Thanks to you both, and thank you for the questions. There are questions in the Q&A. I hope that a couple of those questions just got answered through what Aaron had to say. So people through Zoom, we'll have you better represented next time. We're going to take a break now, so wait quite yet. We're going to take a break, and the next session begins, as I recall, I should recall this quite well, at 10:40. On Zoom, we're not going to shut down the Zoom. We'll just go to sleep, so to speak. So everybody else, if you'd like some coffee, so on and so forth. But if you would join me now and thank you, our two speakers.